The autumn of 1875 painted Amherst, Massachusetts in shades of amber and crimson, its maple trees standing like silent sentinels around the white steepled churches that dotted the landscape. The town prided itself on moral rectitude, where Sunday sermons echoed through cobblestone streets and temperance meetings filled the community hall every Thursday evening. At the heart of this pious community stood the Beecher Mansion, an imposing Victorian structure of dark oak and granite, its Gothic windows reflecting the changing seasons like watchful eyes. Reverend Silas Beecher commanded respect wherever his polished boots touched the wooden floors of the First Congregational Church. His voice, deep and resonant, could fill the sanctuary without strain, drawing parishioners into a trance-like devotion as he spoke of salvation and damnation with equal fervor. The townspeople whispered that God himself had blessed Silas with an otherworldly charisma, evident in how even the most hardened sinners wept openly during his sermons about spiritual purification. "The flesh is weak, my dear congregation," Silas would proclaim from his mahogany pulpit, his steel-gray eyes scanning the packed pews. "But through discipline and divine guidance, we can cleanse ourselves of the corruption that Adam's sin has planted in our very bones." The Beecher family occupied the front pew every Sunday, a picture of Christian perfection. Eunice Beecher, draped in modest black silk, kept her eyes downcast in apparent humility, her gloved hands folded precisely over a leather-bound Bible. Their children, Thaddeus, 28, and already establishing himself as a theological scholar in Boston; Charity, 22, and known for her charitable work with orphans; and young Elias, barely 14, but already showing signs of his father's commanding presence, sat in perfect stillness, their faces masks of reverent attention. What the congregation couldn't see were the purple bruises hidden beneath Charity's high-necked dress, or the way Elias's hands trembled whenever his father's gaze lingered too long upon him. They couldn't hear the muffled sounds that emanated from the mansion's upper floors during the long winter nights, or see the strange symbols that Silas carved into the wooden beams of the cellar during his private meditation sessions. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the town's physician and one of the few men who dared question the Reverend's methods, had grown increasingly troubled by the Beecher children's frequent visits to his practice. Charity suffered from recurring nervous episodes that left her catatonic for days, while Elias bore injuries that seemed inconsistent with the childhood accidents Eunice described in her soft, measured voice. Mrs. Beecher, Dr. Hartwell had said during one particularly concerning visit, when Charity arrived with rope burns around her wrists, perhaps the child would benefit from a change of environment. The city air might— "Doctor," Eunice interrupted, her voice carrying an edge that made the elderly physician step back. "My husband's spiritual guidance has kept our family pure in ways that worldly medicine cannot comprehend. Charity's trials are part of God's plan for her purification." The doctor's concerns deepened when he noticed that Eunice herself had begun showing signs of severe malnutrition, her once plump cheeks now hollow, her eyes holding a glassy quality that spoke of either deep faith or complete madness. The coded entries in her diary, which she carried everywhere, were written in a cipher that combined biblical references with symbols that seemed to predate Christianity itself. As autumn deepened into winter, strange reports began filtering through Amherst's tight-knit community. Mrs. Abernathy, who lived closest to the Beecher mansion, complained of hearing children's voices singing hymns at all hours of the night. The postmaster noted that the family received unusual packages from Boston and New York, heavy crates that required multiple men to carry, always delivered under cover of darkness. Most disturbing of all were the changes in Thaddeus during his visits home from Boston. The young theology professor, once known for his gentle demeanor and scholarly pursuits, now carried himself with an unsettling intensity. His former classmates at Harvard Divinity School whispered about his increasingly radical interpretations of biblical texts, particularly his fascination with Old Testament passages describing ritual purification and the cleansing of bloodlines. The first snow of winter fell on a Tuesday evening, blanketing Amherst in pristine white that seemed to muffle even the church bells. Inside the Beecher mansion, Silas gathered his family in the parlor, the firelight casting dancing shadows across their faces as he opened the leather-bound journal that never left his side. "Tonight," he announced, his voice carrying the same authority that commanded his congregation, "we begin the final phase of our family's purification. The Lord has shown me visions of what we must become to transcend the corruption of this world." Eunice nodded eagerly, her fingers tracing the strange symbols in her own diary. Thaddeus leaned forward with scholarly interest, while Charity sat motionless, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the frost-covered windows. Only Elias showed any sign of resistance, his young face pale with a terror that went beyond normal childhood fears. As the wind howled through the bare branches outside, the Beecher family began their descent into a darkness that would soon consume not only their souls, but threaten to drag the entire town of Amherst into an abyss from which there might be no return. The gaslight flickered against the frost-covered windows of Thaddeus Beecher's private study at Harvard Divinity School, casting eerie shadows across the theological texts that lined his mahogany shelves. It was well past midnight, but sleep had become a stranger to the young professor since his last visit home to Amherst. The revelations his father had shared during those long winter nights had fundamentally altered his understanding of divine purpose and human nature. Miss Catherine Whitmore, 19 and the daughter of a prominent Boston merchant, knocked hesitantly on the study door. She had been struggling with her Hebrew translations, and Professor Beecher had offered private tutoring sessions to help her catch up with her male classmates, a progressive gesture that had earned him praise from the more liberal faculty members. "Come in, Miss Whitmore," Thaddeus called, his voice carrying the same hypnotic quality that ran in the Beecher bloodline. "I trust you've brought the passages we discussed." Catherine entered, clutching her leather satchel against her chest. The study felt different tonight, warmer than usual, with an almost oppressive atmosphere that made her skin prickle with unease. Candles had been arranged in a peculiar pattern around the room, their flames dancing in a rhythm that seemed to follow no earthly wind. "Professor, I've been having the most troubling dreams since our last session," Catherine confessed, settling into the chair across from his desk. "The Hebrew words you taught me, they seem to echo in my mind even when I'm awake." Thaddeus smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "That is precisely what we hope to achieve, my dear student. The ancient language carries power that modern scholars have forgotten. Your dreams are evidence that you're beginning to understand the true nature of spiritual communion." He rose from his chair and moved to stand behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders with a familiarity that would have scandalized proper Boston society. Catherine tensed, but didn't pull away. There was something about Professor Beecher's presence that made resistance feel not just futile, but somehow sinful. "The passages your father shared with me," Thaddeus continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "speak of purification rituals that predate the corrupted interpretations of modern Christianity. Tonight, I want to show you what true spiritual cleansing looks like." Meanwhile, in the Beecher mansion back in Amherst, Silas was conducting his own form of spiritual guidance with his remaining children. The cellar had been transformed into something that bore little resemblance to a Christian place of worship. The walls were covered with symbols that seemed to writhe in the candlelight, and the air was thick with the scent of burning herbs that had no place in any legitimate religious ceremony. Charity knelt on the cold stone floor, her white nightgown torn and stained with substances that defied identification. Her eyes had taken on the same glassy quality as her mother's, but beneath the surface, something wild and desperate still fought for freedom. She had been in the cellar for 3 days now, sustained only by the bitter tea that Eunice forced down her throat during brief moments of consciousness. "The corruption runs deep in this one," Silas murmured to his wife, who stood beside him taking meticulous notes in her coded diary. "But the Lord has shown me how to burn it out completely." Eunice nodded eagerly, her pen scratching across the page as she recorded every detail of her husband's methods. In her mind, she was documenting a holy process, a divine revelation that would one day be studied by theologians around the world. The reality of what she was witnessing had been carefully compartmentalized away, locked behind walls of religious fervor and absolute obedience. Young Elias watched from the shadows at the top of the cellar stairs, his 14-year-old mind struggling to process the horrors unfolding below. He had learned to move silently through the mansion, avoiding the creaking floorboards that might alert his parents to his presence. Tonight, he clutched a small notebook of his own, not filled with religious symbols like his mother's, but with careful observations and sketches that told a very different story. Back in Boston, Catherine Whitmore's screams echoed through the empty halls of the Divinity School, but the thick stone walls ensured that no one would hear her pleas for help. Thaddeus had bound her to an ornate wooden chair that he claimed was used in ancient purification ceremonies, though the rope burns on her wrists suggested purposes far removed from any legitimate religious practice. "You must understand, Miss Whitmore," Thaddeus explained as he prepared the implements he had brought from his father's collection, "that true spiritual awakening requires the complete destruction of worldly shame and modesty. The flesh must be humbled before the spirit can ascend." The young woman's eyes were wide with terror as she realized that her professor's progressive teaching methods were actually something far more sinister. The Hebrew phrases he had taught her weren't prayers or scholarly texts. They were incantations designed to break down her psychological resistance and make her compliant to his increasingly depraved demands. As dawn approached, both locations bore witness to acts that would have horrified even the most hardened criminals. In the Beecher cellar, Charity's spirit finally broke completely, leaving behind only a hollow shell that would do whatever her father commanded without question. In the Harvard study, Catherine's transformation was nearly complete, her mind shattered and rebuilt according to Thaddeus's twisted interpretation of divine will. But in the shadows of the mansion, young Elias continued to document everything he witnessed. His notebook was filling with evidence that would eventually expose the true nature of the Beecher family's spiritual practices, if he could survive long enough to share it with the outside world. The corruption that had taken root in the Beecher bloodline was spreading, reaching beyond the confines of their dark mansion to infect new victims. And as the winter deepened, the family's appetite for their twisted form of purification only grew stronger, threatening to consume everything and everyone that crossed their path. The February blizzard of 1875 had trapped the Beecher family inside their mansion for nearly a week, the howling wind and driving snow creating a cocoon of isolation that suited Silas's purposes perfectly. Eunice Beecher sat at her writing desk in the parlor, her pen moving with mechanical precision across the pages of her leather-bound diary, recording what she believed to be the most sacred work of her life. "Day 847 of the Great Purification," she wrote in her elaborate cipher. "The Lord continues to reveal his divine methods through my beloved husband. Charity's transformation proceeds according to his holy plan, though her earthly vessel grows weak. Perhaps weakness is necessary for the spirit to emerge triumphant." The truth was far more horrifying than Eunice's coded euphemisms suggested. Charity had not left the cellar in over a month, and her physical condition had deteriorated to the point where Dr. Hartwell would have immediately recognized signs of severe abuse and malnutrition. But Eunice saw only what her fractured mind allowed her to see, a daughter being cleansed of original sin through her father's divine guidance. In the kitchen, Eunice prepared the bitter herbal tea that had become Charity's only sustenance. grinding roots and leaves that Silas had ordered from mysterious suppliers in Salem and Boston. The mixture contained substances that dulled the mind and weakened the will, ensuring that Charity remained compliant during her father's increasingly violent purification sessions. "Mother," Elias appeared in the doorway, his young face gaunt from weeks of poor sleep and constant terror. "Charity hasn't spoken in 3 days. Perhaps we should—" "Your sister is communing with angels," Eunice interrupted, her voice carrying the same dreamy quality that had become her constant state. "Your father has explained this to you many times, Elias. Doubt is the voice of Satan trying to corrupt your understanding." Elias watched his mother's hands as she worked, noting the way they trembled slightly, not from age or infirmity, but from the same nervous condition that had begun affecting all the family members, except Silas. The boy had started keeping detailed records of these physical symptoms alongside his other observations, instinctively understanding that they might be important evidence someday. Upstairs in the master bedroom, Silas was conducting what he called a spiritual consultation with Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, the widow of Amherst's former mayor. The woman had come to him seeking comfort after her husband's recent death, but Silas had convinced her that her grief was actually a form of spiritual corruption that required intensive private counseling. "The pain you feel, dear Adelaide," Silas murmured as he positioned her on the ornate bed that had become central to his twisted rituals, "is your soul crying out for purification. Your husband's death was God's way of preparing you for a higher form of spiritual union." Mrs. Thornton, a respectable woman of 53 who had never experienced anything more scandalous than a brief kiss before marriage, found herself unable to resist the Reverend's compelling presence. The tea that Eunice had served during her visit had left her feeling strangely detached from her own body, as if she were watching events unfold from a great distance. Down in the cellar, Charity existed in a twilight state between consciousness and oblivion. The stone walls around her were covered with symbols that seemed to move and shift in the candlelight, some carved by her father's hand, others that appeared to have been scratched into the stone by fingernails worn down to bloody stumps. Her own fingernails, she realized with the small part of her mind that still functioned clearly. The most horrifying aspect of her situation wasn't the physical abuse or even the psychological torture. It was the growing realization that part of her was beginning to accept her father's explanations. The constant repetition of his twisted theology, combined with the mind-altering substances in her tea, had begun to erode her ability to distinguish between reality and the elaborate fantasy that Silas had constructed around his crimes. "Perhaps I am being purified," she thought, during one of her more lucid moments. "Perhaps this pain is necessary for my salvation." The thought terrified her more than any physical torment, because she recognized it as the first sign that her father was succeeding in breaking her completely. Meanwhile, Thaddeus had returned from Boston for what he claimed was a brief family visit. But Elias noticed that his older brother carried with him a leather satchel filled with items that looked suspiciously like the implements their father used in the cellar. The young professor's eyes had taken on the same fevered intensity as Silas's, and he spoke constantly of the new students he was guiding towards spiritual enlightenment. "The work is expanding, Father," Thaddeus reported during one of their private conferences in Silas's study. "I've identified several candidates among the faculty wives who would benefit from our methods. Mrs. Pemberton, in particular, has shown remarkable receptivity to the preparatory teachings." Eunice listened from the hallway, her diary clutched against her chest as she recorded every word. In her mind, she was witnessing the birth of a new form of Christianity, one that would eventually spread throughout New England and beyond, bringing divine purification to all who were worthy of salvation. The reality was that the Beecher family had become a cancer, spreading their corruption through manipulation, drugs, and psychological torture. Each new victim was carefully selected for their vulnerability, Recent widows, struggling students, anyone whose circumstances made them susceptible to the family's twisted form of spiritual guidance. As the blizzard finally began to subside, Elias made a decision that would change everything. Hidden in his small bedroom, he began copying the most damning entries from his notebook onto separate sheets of paper, preparing to smuggle them out of the house when the opportunity arose. He had identified Dr. Hartwell as the one adult in Amherst who might believe his story and take action to stop his family's crimes. But Silas had not survived this long by being careless. He had noticed his youngest son's increasing withdrawal and had begun to suspect that Elias might pose a threat to the family's sacred work. As the snow melted and the roads became passable again, Silas began planning a special purification ceremony, one that would ensure Elias's complete loyalty or eliminate the problem permanently. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either destroy the Beecher family's reign of terror or claim one final victim before their corruption could spread even further into the heart of New England's religious community. The March thaw of 1875 brought with it a false sense of renewal to Amherst, as if the melting snow might wash away the darkness that had settled over the town like a shroud. But inside the Beecher mansion, the approaching spring only intensified Silas's conviction that the time had come for the final phase of his family's purification, a ceremony that would either complete their transformation or destroy them entirely. Elias Beecher crouched in the narrow space between the cellar wall and an old armoire, his 14-year-old body trembling, not from cold, but from the horrific scene unfolding before him. His father stood over Charity, who lay motionless on a stone altar that had been carved with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering candlelight. The girl who had once been his sister was barely recognizable. Her hair had been shaved off, her body marked with scars that formed patterns matching the symbols on the walls. "Tonight, my beloved family," Silas intoned, his voice carrying the same hypnotic quality that had mesmerized his congregation for years. "We transcend the final barrier between the earthly and the divine. Charity has been prepared as our offering, and through her sacrifice we shall achieve the purification that God has demanded of us." Eunice stood beside her husband, her diary open as she prepared to record what she believed would be the most sacred moment in their family's history. Her eyes had taken on a glassy, fevered quality, and she swayed slightly as if hearing music that existed only in her fractured mind. "The angels are singing," she whispered, her pen poised over the page. "I can hear them welcoming our daughter into their celestial choir." Thaddeus had returned from Boston specifically for this ceremony, bringing with him implements that he claimed were blessed by ancient Hebrew scholars, but which Elias recognized as instruments of torture. The young professor's transformation was now complete. Any trace of the gentle academic he had once been had been consumed by the same madness that drove his father. But Elias had not spent these months in passive observation. Hidden beneath his mattress was a collection of evidence that would expose his family's crimes to the world. Detailed sketches of the cellar's layout, copies of his mother's coded diary entries that he had painstakingly deciphered, and most damning of all, a list of names and addresses of his family's victims. As Silas raised the ceremonial blade above Charity's motionless form, Elias made his move. The boy had spent weeks studying the mansion's layout, identifying every creaking floorboard and loose window latch. He slipped from his hiding place and crept toward the cellar stairs, his evidence clutched against his chest. "The purification begins," Silas declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls. At that moment, Elias deliberately knocked over a stack of wooden crates, sending them crashing to the floor with a sound like thunder. The noise shattered the ceremony's solemn atmosphere and sent Silas spinning toward the source of the disturbance. "Elias!" his father roared, his eyes blazing with a fury that went beyond human anger. "You dare interrupt the Lord's work?" But the boy was already running, his feet pounding up the cellar stairs as he heard his father's heavy boots pursuing him. Behind him, Eunice's voice rose in a wailing lament, as if her son's defiance had shattered some fundamental aspect of her reality. Elias burst through the mansion's front door into the cold March night, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he ran toward the center of town. Behind him, he could hear Silas shouting orders to Thaddeus, their voices carrying across the snow-covered landscape like the howls of hunting wolves. Dr. Hartwell's house stood at the end of Elm Street, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. Elias pounded on the door with both fists, his young voice cracking as he screamed for help. When the elderly physician finally answered, still in his nightgown and carrying a lamp, he was shocked by the boy's appearance, wild-eyed, bleeding from numerous small cuts, and clutching a bundle of papers as if his life depended on them. "Dr. Hartwell!" Elias gasped, collapsing against the doorframe. "You have to help me. My family, they're not what everyone thinks they are. They're monsters." The doctor pulled the boy inside and quickly locked the door behind him. He had suspected for months that something was wrong in the Beecher household, but the evidence that Elias spread across his kitchen table exceeded his worst fears. The sketches showed torture devices and ritual chambers, while the decoded diary entries revealed a systematic pattern of abuse that had been disguised as religious practice. "My God," Dr. Hartwell whispered as he examined a detailed drawing of the cellar altar. "How long has this been going on?" "Years," Elias replied, his voice hollow with exhaustion and trauma. "Maybe since before I was born. My father, he believes he's doing God's work, and my mother helps him because she thinks it will save our souls." As they spoke, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the street outside. Silas and Thaddeus had tracked Elias to the doctor's house and were now pounding on the door with increasing violence. "Open this door, Hartwell," Silas commanded, his voice carrying the authority he had wielded over his congregation for decades. "Return my son to me immediately, or face the consequences of interfering with God's plan." Dr. Hartwell looked at the terrified boy huddled in his kitchen and made a decision that would change the course of Amherst's history. He gathered Elias's evidence and helped the boy escape through the back door, directing him toward the sheriff's office while he remained behind to face the Beecher men. When Silas finally broke down the door, he found only the elderly doctor standing calmly in his parlor, a shotgun cradled in his arms. "Your son is beyond your reach now, Reverend," Dr. Hartwell said quietly. "And soon, the whole world will know what you've done." The confrontation that followed would be remembered by Amherst's residents for generations to come. But by then, Elias was already at the sheriff's office, spreading his evidence across another table as he told his story to men whose faces grew paler with each revelation. The Beecher family's reign of terror was finally coming to an end, but the true horror was only beginning to emerge as investigators prepared to enter the mansion and discover the full extent of the corruption that had festered in the heart of their supposedly righteous community. The dawn of March 15, 1875, broke gray and cold over Amherst, Massachusetts, as Sheriff William Morrison led a group of armed men toward the Beecher mansion. The evidence that young Elias had provided was so damning that Morrison had immediately telegraphed the state authorities, but he knew that waiting for their arrival might mean more lives lost. The boy's testimony had painted a picture of horror that demanded immediate action. Dr. Hartwell rode alongside the sheriff, his medical bag prepared for whatever they might find inside the mansion. The elderly physician had spent the night treating Elias's injuries and listening to the boy's full account of his family's crimes. Each detail had been more horrifying than the last, building a case that would shock even the most hardened investigators. "Remember," Sheriff Morrison called to his men as they approached the mansion's imposing front door, "we're dealing with people who believe they're doing God's work. That makes them more dangerous than ordinary criminals." "Oh," The mansion stood silent in the morning light, its dark windows reflecting the grey sky like dead eyes. No smoke rose from the chimneys, and the usual signs of domestic life were conspicuously absent. The only sound was the wind whistling through the bare branches of the oak trees that surrounded the property. Morrison pounded on the front door with the butt of his rifle. "Reverend Beecher, this is Sheriff Morrison. Open this door in the name of the law." The silence that followed was broken only by a low moaning sound that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the house. Dr. Hartwell recognized it immediately, the sound of someone in severe physical distress. "Break it down," Morrison ordered. The heavy oak door splintered under the combined assault of 3 men, revealing an interior that bore little resemblance to the respectable home that Amherst's residents had imagined. The parlor was in complete disarray, furniture overturned, and strange symbols painted on the walls in what appeared to be dried blood. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs and something else, something that made the men cover their noses with handkerchiefs. They found Eunice Beecher in the kitchen, sitting at her writing desk as if nothing had happened. Her diary lay open before her, and she continued to write in her elaborate cipher even as the armed men surrounded her. Her eyes had the vacant quality of someone whose mind had completely detached from reality. "Mrs. Beecher," Dr. Hartwell said gently, approaching her with the caution one might use with a dangerous animal. "Where is your husband? Where are your children?" Eunice looked up at him with a serene smile that was more terrifying than any expression of rage could have been. "They have ascended," she said in a voice that sounded like a child reciting a well-rehearsed lesson. "The purification is complete. They are with the angels now." The cellar door stood open, and the moaning sound grew louder as the men descended the stone steps. What they found there would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. The chamber had been transformed into something that belonged in the darkest corners of human imagination. Walls covered with symbols that seemed to move in the lamplight. An altar stained with substances that defied identification, and implements of torture that spoke to a level of depravity that challenged their understanding of human nature. Charity Beecher lay on the altar, barely alive, but breathing. Her condition was so severe that Dr. Hartwell immediately began emergency treatment, though he privately doubted she would survive the trauma her body had endured. The girl's eyes were open but vacant, staring at something that existed only in her shattered mind. "Dear God," one of the deputies whispered, his voice breaking, "what kind of monsters could do this to their own child?" But Silas and Thaddeus were nowhere to be found. A search of the mansion revealed that they had fled during the night, taking with them a collection of documents and artifacts that suggested their crimes extended far beyond what Elias had witnessed. The boys' evidence was damning, but it represented only a fraction of the Beecher family's activities. Sheriff Morrison organized search parties that scoured the surrounding countryside, but the 2 men had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed them. Some residents claimed to have seen figures moving through the woods toward the old Salem Road, while others reported strange lights in the abandoned Whitmore farm that had been empty since the witch trials of the previous century. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of the Beecher family's corruption. Thaddeus's activities in Boston had claimed at least 6 victims among the student body and faculty wives, while Silas's spiritual counseling had affected dozens of Amherst residents over the years. Many of the victims were too traumatized or ashamed to come forward, but the physical evidence found in the mansion told a story of systematic abuse that had been disguised as religious practice. Eunice Beecher was declared mentally incompetent and committed to the state asylum, where she continued to write in her coded diary until her death 3 years later. Her final entries, when deciphered, revealed that she had genuinely believed her family was conducting sacred work, a delusion so complete that she never acknowledged the reality of their crimes. Charity survived her physical injuries, but never recovered mentally. She was placed in the care of distant relatives in Vermont, where she lived out her days in a state of childlike innocence, her memories of the cellar apparently erased by the trauma she had endured. The mansion itself was burned by unknown parties on the night of the autumn equinox, just as Elias had predicted in his testimony. The fire was so intense that it melted the stone foundation, leaving only a blackened crater where the house had stood. Local residents claimed that the flames burned in colors that had no place in any natural fire, and that the smoke formed shapes that resembled the symbols found in the cellar. Silas Beecher was placed in the care of Dr. Hartwell, who legally adopted the boy and helped him rebuild his life. The young man eventually became a respected journalist, dedicating his career to exposing corruption and protecting the vulnerable. He never spoke publicly about his family's crimes, but his private papers, discovered after his death in 1923, provided historians with a complete account of the Beecher family's reign of terror. The case officially remained open, as Silas and Thaddeus Beecher were never found. Over the years, there were occasional reports of similar crimes in other New England towns, cases involving charismatic religious leaders who used their authority to commit unspeakable acts against their followers. Investigators noted similarities in the methods and symbols used, leading some to believe that the Beecher men had continued their work in other communities. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the Beecher family was the discovery, made decades later, that Eunice's coded diaries contained references to other families, other bloodlines that had been chosen for purification. The entries suggested that the Beechers were not unique, but rather part of a larger network of corruption that had taken root in the religious communities of New England. The burned remains of the mansion became a place that Amherst residents avoided, especially after dark. Children were warned never to play near the site, and adults crossed themselves when forced to pass by. On certain nights, particularly during the autumn equinox, locals reported seeing lights moving through the ruins and hearing voices singing hymns in languages that predated Christianity. The town eventually built a new church on the opposite side of Amherst, as if trying to distance itself from the corruption that had festered in the heart of their community. But the memory of the Beecher family lingered like a stain that could never be completely washed away, a reminder that evil could hide behind the most respectable facades and that the most dangerous monsters were often those who claimed to speak for God. In the end, the most corrupted sexual acts committed by the Beecher family were not just crimes against their victims, but an assault on the very foundations of faith and community that held society together. Their legacy served as a warning that would echo through the generations, that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that the greatest evil often wears the mask of righteousness.